I see it is you've got two choices. You can either keep pretending like nothing bad's ever gonna happen to you, and then when it does, you're saying, uh-oh, or you can get ahead of what's coming so that when it does, not if, you're ready for it. And you're sitting pretty, sipping on Mai Tais next to the pool, working on that Caribbean suntan, because you got it covered. So folks, it's time for you to learn the truth about money. It's time for you to take back control of your money so that you are ready for what's about to happen. By doing that, you're setting yourself up for absolute success. No matter what comes your way, you're ready for it. And that's what I want for you, and I want to help you with that. So go to chrisnaugle.com and sign up for the Wealth Webinar. We do them every Wednesday at 1 p.m., and you need to be there because it's time.
For over 90 years, we've been crash testing our cars in the tireless pursuit of automotive safety. At Volvo, safety's been first since 1927. We've saved millions of lives with the invention of the three-point seatbelt in 1959. At Volvo, we've made driving safer for you and them. Visit safety.findlayvolvo.com to learn more.
So they say if you give a man a gun, he'll rob a bank. But if you give a man a bank, he'll rob everybody. But the good news for you is Private Money Club runs solely on peer-to-peer relationships, which means no banks allowed. So finally, there's a community for real estate entrepreneurs where it is truly a win-win solution. This community is a place where you can connect with other lenders and other borrowers, and the end result's massive growth for you. You get to build your real estate empire, and you get to do it solving other people's problems. So if that sounds like a place you want to be, well then join us. Go to privatemoneyclub.com/Kelly. And if you want $500 off, just add the code Kelly500 and I'll knock $500 off the Premier membership. We'll see you on the inside.
Welcome to the Kelly Cardenas podcast, where attitude is everything. On today's show, you just got me. We get to go unscripted today, and I wanted to jump on here and spend some time with you because there's about a couple of subjects for me that have just been on my brain, and I've been very, very fortunate in the last couple of days, actually last couple of weeks, not only on the podcast, but just with a couple of principles. And those principles that we're going to talk about today are going to be the power of relationships, the scrap, and a thing called the vibe room. So let me hop right into the vibe room itself. People that watch the podcast and connect with the podcast, they've been asking about how could I experience it live? How can I meet these people? I have people all the time that will hear about someone on the podcast. Say, for instance, just recently, Eddie George. And they hear about Eddie George like, oh, wow, I want to meet him. Can I get him on my show, or can I connect with him? And what I want you to know is we created an environment called the Vibe Room that's a live podcast. And you get to be in the room with these iconic people. You get to hear their conversations, be voyeurs into those conversations, and also, guess what? Get to hang out with them afterwards. And so we have the Vibe Room on October 5th. And I'm very honored to be able to have Thurl Bailey, an NBA legend and a Utah Jazz legend, the voice of the Utah Jazz. But more than that, an incredible human being. An incredible human being that's willing and ready to. I sat down with him at lunch a couple weeks ago, and it was as if the whole room didn't exist. It was just Thurl and I thought, but there was a room full of people, and they were vying for his time. But every time I talked to him and every time he engaged in a conversation with me, it was like the whole world shut off and I was the only person that existed. There's very few people in the world, especially an iconic person like him, that everyone's vying for their time, that would be willing to sit down and just say, hey, look, you're the only person in the room. You're the one that means something to me because I want to make sure that you feel special. It's not about him feeling special. So he's going to be there. The second one that's going to be at the Vibe Room is a young man by the name of Larry Namer. And Larry Namer is the founder of the E-Entertainment Network. He changed what TV was. He's a pioneer. And his story is so incredible. But again, he's a human being that spends time. And when he spends time with you, he genuinely has conversations. So it's not about him. It's not about all his accolades, although he has many. It's just about other people. But it's incredible to see how his mind works. And we get a chance to be able to have that in Salt Lake City at the Edison House on October 5th. The next one that I get a chance to have is I wanted to add music to the Vibe Room because the Vibe Room is just that. It's a vibe. And so I wanted to create basically a talk show that had the heart of Oprah, the intellect of David Letterman, and the comedy of Jimmy Fallon. But I also wanted to add a musical element. You know, Jimmy Fallon has the roots, and I'm just lucky enough to have a friend named Damian Horn, who's a award-winning singer-songwriter, traveled with the Music Mafia, has a phenomenal story. But this guy is a mix between Maxwell and Bruno Mars, and he's going to be our musical guest at the Vibe Room. And the Edison House is where we're housing it this time, and it's a speakeasy club, kind of jazz, 50s club. It is unbelievable. So people have been on me about this, and they've been asking, like, can I come? What do I got to do to get a ticket? Well, I want you to know that we've only got 13 tickets left. 13 tickets left. It's a very limited engagement, and so I'll drop the link in the bio and all that stuff. You can click the link. Actually, it'll say the Vibe Room. You can click that and check that out. But the reason why the Vibe Room happened is because the podcast and because all of you have been listening to it and been supporting. And here's a couple of aspects of it. People ask me all the time, like, how have you been able to get the guests that you have on the podcast? And here's the way. It's very, very simple. I just reach out to them. And I just had a young man named Eddie George, and he's a Heisman Trophy winner, amazing human being. And he's the running back for, I believe, the greatest team on earth, which is the Tennessee Titans and the Houston Oilers. And people ask me about, like, how'd you get him? And it was simple for me. I wrote him a message on Instagram about 3 years ago. Then I followed up. And for the past 3 years, I've been sending him messages, I've been sending him videos, and finally he responded. And that is the part, for me, it's not just about trying it one time and then giving up. It was about going at it. And I was talking to my brother yesterday, and I was telling him, I said, look, I set my sights on Jerry Rice, greatest receiver to ever play the game. And he was like, oh, really? I said, yeah. I started messaging him, and for the last probably 3-4 weeks, I've been messaging him almost every single day. I send him a message, and I say, hey, Mr. Rice, just want to tell you that you're the greatest of all time, and I'd love to have you on the podcast. The reason why I started the podcast is because I didn't want my kids to worship idols. I wanted them to be inspired by icons just like you, and I look forward to having you on the show. And the reason why I tell you that is because probably one of the most challenging things that we'll ever do in our life is just to simply start. And I got permission very, very early on from two amazing people, my parents, my mama and my pop, that told me that I could do anything. I could do anything that I put my mind to, but just because I could do it didn't make it my purpose. So that helped me along on this journey of saying, like, what's the worst that could happen? If I reach out to someone to come on the podcast, or I reach out to someone to be at the Vibe Room, which is the podcast live, what's the worst that could happen? They say no? Well, they're already not my friend. So that's the worst that could happen. And so I want to invite every single one of you is to realize the power of relationships. And relationships for me have been very simple because I kind of learned a different way from my mom, from my pops, from my brother, and from my other friends. It was just about contributing to people. And you've heard me say this before, but I'll say it again, and I want you to, if you have a pen, write this down. The longer you could delay the ask, the stronger the relationship will be. And I found this to be true in every aspect. There's so many times where I go into an environment, whether it be a networking environment. I happen to co-host the #1 networking conference in the world with Dr. Greg Reed, who is an incredible friend, and I'll tell you about him later. But that's the greatest event that you can't go to unless you're invited. And I happen to be the co-host for it, so I can help you to be invited. But the reason why I tell you about that is because when I go into environments like that, I'm just looking to contribute. Like I don't want anything, and I don't need anything from anybody. And it doesn't mean that I'm going to be an island or, that I have to do everything on my own. It just means that I'm not going in looking. And that is a part that has helped me tremendously over time. So I want to go into this power of relationships thing because I think it's a big subject, and it's one of those things where I think people freak out a lot because I have the same friends since I was in 4th grade. So my friend Will, that you'll hear me talk about on the podcast, he's been my best friend since 4th grade. My brother, obviously he's been with me my whole entire life. My buddy Dave since 6th grade. My buddy Dale since 8th grade. My buddy Andy since 9th grade. And my buddy Alfred since I was in 8th grade. And these are all my friends that I still hang out with. The cool thing is you can't replace friendships like that. And there's not really a blueprint on how to be able to navigate the relationships unless you're just present. And so when you're present with these people and you connect with them and you think long term, so we think long ball. We're thinking long ball in all these relationships, and we're not just thinking, oh, what can they do for me today? And I invite you on this, although it's the long ball. It's not a situation where you're going to be able to get an advantage right off the bat. And so I want to take you down the line of this power of relationships. You see, a couple years ago, I was on Clubhouse. Now, a lot of you are on Clubhouse too, and I don't judge you for it. Please don't judge me for being on there. But I was on there, and I had met a guy named Jason Redman. And this was years ago that I met Jason Redman. Jason Redman was friends with a guy named Gary Spellman of mine, a friend of mine named Gary Spellman. So Gary introduced me to Jason Redman. Jason Redman texted me one day and said, hey, I'm going to be on Clubhouse with this guy named Justin Breen. I said, cool. So I just listened, and on Clubhouse on that day, it was just those two. And they were talking, and I was like, I texted Jason Redman and said, hey, you're amazing. He's an American hero. He wrote the book Trident. If you haven't read it, read it. He's an incredible human. Well, when I listened to it, I was like, oh, cool. I texted Jason, said, hey, man, I just want to congratulate you on that. And Justin reached out to me because he saw me on Clubhouse. He said, hey, why don't you come on next week? And we do this every week. So I jumped on. Well, a couple weeks later, I jumped on that Clubhouse, and they were interviewing a guy named Greg Reed, Dr. Greg Reed. And Dr. Greg Reed wasn't talking about the hustle. He wasn't talking about how to make millions or all these things. What he was talking about, he talked about his son and how his relationship with his son really taught him about a lot of things that he wasn't privy to before. And when he told the story about his son, and he said that there was a lady that asked him, they said, do you reward your son for doing work in the house? And he said, yes, for doing chores. And she said, you know what, you're ruining your child. And he's like, what do you mean? He got kind of offended. And she said, well, imagine what you're teaching him is to do things that he doesn't like, and the reward is going to be money, as opposed to having him do stuff and pay him for things that he absolutely loves. And then the things that maybe he doesn't, like the chores of the house, are just the responsibility for living in the house that he lived in. And it blew my mind. And this guy went completely different. And he was talking about his family. He was talking about his son, talking about relationships. So I reached out to Greg Reed, and I said, hey, can you come on the podcast? He came on. We made fast friends within a couple of minutes. And he said, hey, man, I like your vibe. I'd like you to be a part of our tribe. Why don't you come down to the office? I got in the car. They sent me a little message, and I got to the office, and guess what? It was only 6 blocks from my house. So 6 blocks from my house, unbeknownst to me, there's a guy named Greg Reed. I heard about him. He talked about his son, but I didn't know who he was. When I walked in, I connected with him. We played pool. We hung out. We became friends. Well, as I started to go, he handed me a book before I left. I read the book in about 2 to 3 hours. I annotated it. I brought it back to him, and I said, here's the book back. He said, why are you bringing me the book? I said, I just want to show you and prove to you that I read it. And he said, I believe you. So I read that book, and then, he gave me another one. I went home and I read that book, and he gave me another one. I read that book, and I started to realize what I just tripped upon was a man that had a lot more influence than I even realized. This was the Michael Jordan of the personal development realm. This was the guy. So he had 48 best-selling books, had spoke all over the world, including the United Nations, had a star on the Walk of Fame in Las Vegas. And here I was. That wasn't the reason why I walked into the situation. I just started playing pool with the guy. So we're playing pool, we're playing Frisbee, we're just hanging out. And we don't talk about business. We don't talk about any of those things. We just have a good time. We start forming a relationship. Well, every time I go over to the house, there's someone new at the house, and, he introduces me to them, but he generally would always introduce me with just the first name. So I'd play pool with them, hang out with them. They would ask me what I did. I would turn it back on them. And the easiest way that you could think of this is honestly just turn the question. Like if somebody asks you what you do, just ask them what they do. And then they'll start talking about them and then ask them questions about them. Be interested as opposed to trying to be interesting. Right? It's a little cliche, but I tell you, it works every single time. And it's not a technique. It's because I'm truly curious about what the people do because I already know what I do. So one of the people that I got a chance to meet over at the house one time with Greg was a guy named Larry. And I met Larry's really cool guys from New York. And we got a chance to talk. He talked to me about his son. He talked to me about, his life, East Coast, West Coast, the adjustment, all the stuff. And then Greg told me, he said, did you know who that is? And I said, yeah, that's Larry. He said, well, that's Larry Namer. Larry Namer was the founder of the E! Entertainment Network, founded the Kardashians, started, reality TV as we know it today. But the power of relationships, guys, is massive. So I'm hanging out with Greg. I meet Larry. Larry is just an incredible human being, great friend of mine now. And Greg tells me about, an event that we're going to do, and it's called Secret Knock. And, I got a chance to go to it, and now I'm the co-host of it with him in Prosperity Camp and things like that. And he said, hey, we're going to have this guy named James Dixon. So I looked up James Dixon on Instagram, and I thought he was a pretty cool guy. He seemed like he had a great message. And I had made a video saying that, Greg had asked me to speak at Secret Knock, gave me 15 minutes. And this was a major thing. And I was so excited. I ran to my wife and I said, hey, baby, I get a chance to do this. And she's like, hold on for a second. Our friends just called us and let us know that Hawaii is back on because we had planned it probably about 6 months before, but then they had canceled the trip. And I said, yeah, okay, Hawaii, yeah, whatever. But I want you to know I got this opportunity. It's huge. It's like with the Michael Jordan of the personal development realm. And I get to be at the #1 networking event in the world that you can't even go to, even if you wanted to, unless you were invited. And I get a chance to speak there. I got 15 minutes there. This is amazing. And my wife's like, oh, cool. When is the date? I said the date. She's like, oh, that is the same date that we're going to Hawaii. Well, I was kind of back and forth on it. And I called my brother and I said, hey, Rob, I just want to let you know I got a little dilemma. He said, what's the dilemma? I said, well, I got the opportunity to speak at Secret Knock, #1 networking conference in the world that you can't even go to unless you're invited. And I got invited and I'm speaking. But it happens to be on the same date that I had already committed to go to Hawaii with Brooklyn, and then they canceled it, and now it's back on. He said, there's no dilemma. You already committed to your wife, and he hung up on me. Well, I knew what I had to do at that time. I went to Greg, and I told him, I said, look, Greg, I can't go. I can't go to Secret Knock. And and I said, I made a commitment to my wife, and he said, high five, great decision. And it was then that I understood the character of the man. And I went to that trip in Hawaii, and I did that, and came back, and I was sitting with Greg out in front of his house one day after that, and he sat down with me, and he said, hey, man, what do you think about co-hosting Secret Knock and Prosperity Camp as we move forward and we do it together? It's amazing when you choose your family, then God provides everything else. But leading up to that, when I was going to host the first Secret Knock, then Greg told me about this guy named James Dixon. So James Dixon, I look him up on Instagram. He seems like a cool guy. I had posted that video that I just told you about Hawaii and the opportunity. I had no idea who it was going to impact, but James watched the video. So James reaches out to me and says, hey, man, how are you doing? I want to connect. And then I asked him to be on the podcast, and he agreed. And then I started doing some research, and the dude has 128 million subscribers on YouTube and over 125 million views. Now, the access to this man was because of a friend that I met. It wasn't because of me, and it wasn't because of my character. It wasn't because of any of those things. It was because I met someone that was a friend. I didn't ask for anything. I just wanted to contribute. And then he introduced me. And so when he introduced me, that introduction carried weight. And so I met James Dixon, and, this man was incredible. They call him Superman. He's a unilateral amputee and had 33 surgeries before he was 11 years old. His 34th surgery, they went in, they put him under. They didn't tell him, but they took his leg. wakes up at 11 years old with no leg. And for, 25, 30 years, he disguises the leg until one day in his 40s, he says, look, I'm not going to hide anymore. And once he stops hiding, guess what? He becomes one of the top motivational speakers in the entire world. But James is just my friend. And that's the cool thing. When you make friends with people and you're curious about what it is that they're doing, the power of relationships is crazy. Well, then James Dixon, I introduced him to a couple of my friends. I introduced him to a guy named Sean Finnegan. Introduced him to a guy named Peter Anthony Wynn. And then he introduced me to a guy named Dr. Jason Henderson. And Dr. Jason Henderson introduced James to Thurl Bailey, who is one of the top NBA players in the world and one of the most iconic and the voice of the Utah Jazz. He's a legend. And James ended up playing basketball with Thurl, and James brought him to that lunch where Thurl sat down with me, and the whole room disappeared, and I got to talk to an NBA legend. Well, because of that, I connected with Thurl Bailey. Now then I reached out to him and I said, hey, I'd love to have you on the podcast, but even better, I'd love to have you at the Vibe Room. Thurl, without even thinking about it, he says, I'm in. I run into the room to my wife and I raise my hands in the air. Oh my gosh, this is so incredible. I got Thurl Bailey. My wife grew up in Utah and was a Utah Jazz fan, and her brother went to Thurl Bailey's camp when he was a kid. And I raised my hand, and I'm like, oh my gosh, can you believe this, baby? Thurl Bailey, I get to interview Thurl Bailey. And my wife looked at me and said, no, he gets to be interviewed by you. And that's exactly what my brother said. And that's exactly what my mom said when she was alive. And see, the power of relationship is so very important. This morning, the reason why I've got a huge smile on my face too is I got a chance to go up to LA. And this isn't me, pounding my chest saying I'm great and I'm all these things. What I want to tell you is this morning I got a chance to spend 2 hours in the car with Dr. Greg Reed. Greg Reed, or Greg, my friend, on the way up to LA. You know how many people would love to spend 2 hours in the car with the Michael Jordan of the personal development industry? But I got to because he's my friend. And we went up and we supported our other friend named Larry Namer. And Larry Namer's the founder of the E-Entertainment Network. And we got a chance to go up there and see some AI robots that they're working on and this AI technology that they're working on. And it is unbelievable. And there was probably 9 people in the room. And the only way to get there was by being invited. And Larry only invited his friends. You see, the power of relationships to get you in the room, your character will keep you there. So I want to invite every one of you to think about a way that you could start contributing. Take your superpower, because a lot of times it's somebody else's weakness. And it brings me to a place where I tell you, and Greg and I were having this conversation on the way back. So I got not only 2 hours on the way there, 2 hours on the way back from LA. We made it back from San Diego or Carlsbad to LA and back by 1 o'clock. This is a feat in itself. But on the way back, what we were talking about is scrap. We were talking about the scrap gene. And when I say the scrap gene, it goes like this. I believe that scrap starts off with what you see and what you hear. What you see, what you hear, and what you become aware of through your senses. Your environment can either take you down or it could build you up and give you scrap. It could put you in a place where when the chips are down, what do? How do you do it? But most of the time, what you do and how you do it is based on what you see and what you hear and what you become aware of through your senses. And most of the time, that comes from the people that you put yourself around and the relationships that you have built. You see, when the chips are down now, I have the top motivational speaker in the world named James Dixon in my corner. When I have a crazy idea that I don't know that will work, I could call Larry Namer and say, I got this crazy idea. And he'd say, I had one too. I didn't have an invitation to the red carpet, but I had a camera and I hopped the fence And there, the E-Entertainment Network was born. When I have a book idea, when I have a marketing idea, when I need speaking counsel, and I'm down in the dumps, you know who I could call? Dr. Greg Reed. The power of relationships is so important, and see in this scrap. It's going to be what you see, what you hear, and what you become aware of through your senses, and most of the time it's going to be the relationships that are around you. The second thing is based off of what you've heard or what you've seen or what you've become aware of. It's what you believe. Some people will tell me, I believe this. Well, most of the time, what you believe is based off of what you've heard, what you've seen, and your relationships. See, my parents told me that anything was possible. So when I reached out to Eddie George to be on the podcast, and he's been a hero of mine, and I've followed that team since I was 6 years old. All my friends know that I'm a Houston Oilers fan. When I reached out to him, my parents said that I could do anything that I put my mind to. But it didn't mean that it was going to happen overnight. And it took 3 years. Maybe Jerry Rice takes 5. But that's okay. We'll get him. My brother's favorite author is John Gordon. I reached out to John Gordon. Said, hey, my name is Kelly. You are my brother's favorite author, and he would think that I was really cool if you would be on my podcast. And guess what? September 7th, John Gordon's going to be on the show. And so when you have this scrap in you, you start to realize that what's the worst that could happen? But your scrap starts with what you see, what you hear, and what you become aware of through your senses, and then it goes to your belief. And see, what is your belief in those times? Sometimes when the chips are down, if our belief system is, oh man, the world's against me, that's what generally is going to happen. And it brings us to this last one, which is your action. My friend Greg Reed told me, he said, it's not the law of attraction, it's the action inside that word that actually makes things happen. Now think about it. Your action is based off your belief. Your belief is based off what you see and what you hear. And what you see and what you hear is generally comes from the relationships that you build. So imagine when you build these relationships around you of amazing people, guess what starts to happen? Amazing things. Guess what you start to do? Amazing things. For me, it's been incredible because a lot of my heroes now are becoming human. And what I'm seeing is that I have superpowers that some other person, it's their weakness, and I can give to them. And when I contribute to them, guess what starts to happen? There's magic everywhere in it. So when I talk about the power of relationships, it's not just about the Larry Namers or the Thurl Baileys or the Greg Reeds or the Eddie George or the James Dixons that everybody hears about. But it's the Nick Horgans of the world. It's the Nick Horgan who's in my neighborhood, who our sons played football together. He was a coach, and we just chatted at the pool a couple of times. And I had no idea who Nick was, but the hospitality industry does. They don't know who Nick is. And it's amazing because when I was walking my dog today, I was talking to Nick, and he gave me a compliment. And I said, I want to thank you, Nick, because every time that I'm around anyone in the hospitality industry and I mention your name, doors open up. What doors are you opening for somebody else? What doors are you opening for somebody else? How are you contributing to them? Are you delaying the ask? And are you just pouring into them? Are you getting to a point where people will ask you if they can do something for you? And then imagine, like a savings account, you just continued to say, I just want to pour into you. I just want to pour into you. I just want to pour into you. That creates a safety for a lot of people. And so that's the reason why I want to invite all of you to the Vibe Room, is because I just talked with one of my buddies, and he's coming out. He is Moose Craft, Moos Craft on Instagram. And he's coming out and he called me and he's like, hey man, I just want to tell you, the last Vibe Room, you told everybody to get up and make sure that you didn't just meet the people in the light that were on the stage, that you met the people in the room. And he said, I talked to a guy and we connected. And then the next week I found myself signing an NDA. And when I signed the NDA, then I found out about this, some private lending and that he was doing. And then now I'm able to do some business with this guy that was in the audience that didn't get interviewed. And so what I want to invite you as we close, it's not always the person in the light that's going to have the largest impact. It's not always the person that is has all the followers or has the voice or is on stage. A lot of times it's going to be the person sitting next to you. It's going to be this person sitting next to you. It's going to be the person next to you at the grocery store. Make a friend out of everyone. That's what my pop said. He said, you never know where someone's from. You never know where they're going, and you'll never know where you're going to meet up with them again. So make a friend out of everyone. And I've failed at this a lot. I failed at it a ton. And my pops would give me grace. He would encourage me. He would lift me up. But I would fail at it. I would get mad. I would lose my cool or, things like that. And then I'd realize, man, I'm going to meet up with this person again. And I guarantee you, you're going to. So when you do come to the Vibe Room, if you do, the crazy thing is there's only 13 tickets left now. Actually, I sent out an email probably about an hour and a half ago, and we almost sold out within like 10 minutes. But now there's only 13 tickets left. And the Vibe Room, you never know who you're going to meet there. Every single person is a qualified person in so many different areas. Plus, you're going to have the people on stage. Plus, you're going to be entertained with music. Plus, you're going to be entertained with sports. Plus, you're going to be entertained with entertainment. The top. The trailblazers. So we don't bring any secondhand information. We go right to the source. And there's going to be opportunities throughout the year. October 5th, Salt Lake City, the Vibe Room. There's also an opportunity in March 19th through the 21st. That is the Secret Knock. And the only way that you can get to Secret Knock, not by paying. You can't even buy your way in if you're not invited. Now, you have to buy a ticket once you're invited. But I know a guy who can invite you. I want to thank every single one of you for rocking with me on the podcast, for being with me. And I want to thank my brother, Rob, because I had a conversation with him yesterday, and he was like, hey, man, I watched the podcast, and he's like an avid watcher and listener, and he's like, I think you could do this. This would be cool. Check this out. Try this out. I said, cool, Rob, I'm good. And I just want to honor him all the time. When you have great friends, when you have amazing friends, and you have phenomenal relationships, listen to them. Listen to them. And apply it. The power of relationships, guys, is everything. Is everything in life. And if you work on those relationships, you'll build your scrap. And when you build your scrap, ain't nothing can take you down. Nothing. Because you'll have a relationship in your life that can be able to help you through that, or just to be able to give you some counsel in it. But every one of you who's been listening to the podcast, every one of you who's been watching the podcast and sharing, I want to thank you. And I want to thank you because for me, it's never been about numbers, about, I say that we're in the top 1%, but that's just, I didn't even focus on that. That just happened, but it happened because of you. And I want to thank every one of you. I want to thank our sponsors, Mr. Chris Nagel, Jim DiGiulio, Volvo Cars of Las Vegas, Findlay Volvo Cars of Las Vegas, and Poppington. Because if it ain't Poppingtons, it's just popcorn. So go bold. That's what they say. But my heart is with every one of you for the support. And I said it, the last podcast is, thank you for letting me be myself. And what I promise to do for you is bring you the most quality people with the highest integrity, and bring you some of the stories, some of the untold stories, some of the stories from people that are, in the limelight, and some people that maybe you would never hear of until they came on the podcast. But every single one of them will bring you absolutely incredible value. Thank you again for listening to the podcast. I look forward to seeing you at the Vibe Room, October 5th, Salt Lake City, the Edison House. And ladies and gentlemen, I am officially off the hot seat.